There are 30 children in this class. 22 of them are Black, 4 of them are Latinx, and 4 of them are white. The goal of the lesson in which we're going to be diving in was to learn to understand numbers, fractions, as numbers on the number line. Now, that may seem very simple to you, but in fact, it's not simple at all. And children typically think of number lines as having only whole numbers on them, like lists, and think of fractions as like parts of pizzas or parts of brownies or things like that, because that's pretty much what they get exposed to. So the notion that a fraction is a number that lives on the line, and that in fact the line is getting more and more populated with numbers as you learn more and more mathematics, is a very difficult idea, and it's not easy actually to figure out what number is where the orange arrow is pointing to. And of the 30 children in the class, 23 of them had an answer at that point of a number other than 1/3, which is the correct answer. So Anaya was selected to go to the board and say what she came up with and explain her reasoning, and we're going to watch her explanation. Listen closely and see what you think about her reasoning and her answer.
I put 1/7 because there's...
Did she say 1/7?
Yeah. Because there's 7 equal parts, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7.
Before you agree or disagree, I want you to ask questions if there's something you don't understand about what she did. No agreeing and disagreeing, just all you can do right now is ask Anaya questions. Who has a question for her? Okay, Tony, what's your question for her? Go ahead, it's your turn.
Why did you pick 1/7?
Okay, so here's the transcript again. And there were 3 spaces that I'd like to call your attention to. The first is when Tony speaks while Anaya is explaining her thinking and says, "Did she say 1/7?" And Anaya turns to her and says, "Yes." Another moment is Tony begins to ask a question and says, "Why did?" and then starts to laugh at another student across the room. And the third is she asks her question and says, "Why did you pick 1/7?" So each of these constitutes a discretionary space in which the teacher either acts or doesn't act, reads Tony one way or another, thinks about how Anaya is positioned, and acts or doesn't act. And my colleague Imani Gafni makes very clear to me all of the time that acting or not acting are both actions, and nothing is neutral. So whatever one decides to do contributes to the positioning of these 2 Black girls in this class, and contributes to the way the rest of the class also has opportunities to learn and sees them. So both girls and their classmates are implicated by whatever happens in those discretionary spaces. I'm going to ask you to watch the discretionary space again.
I put 1/7 because there's...
Did she say 1/7?
Yeah.
Why did you pick 1/7?
Okay, so let's look inside that discretionary space, just the last one. Why did you say 1/7? So that's the 19th out of 20 discretionary spaces just in this 1 minute, 28 seconds, okay? We're gonna look inside discretionary space 19. So what's going on here? Tony is asking a question of Anaya. Tony is laughing and playing with her hair. Tony and Anaya are also Black girls who are positioned with different statuses in this classroom. They have different physical embodiments, and they perform their Black girlness in different ways. So, what to do next? Just take a moment and think, either, what would you do next after Tony says, "Why did you pick 1/7?" Or what do you think might happen if you aren't sure what you would do? Just take a moment to think about it. So I'll offer some possibilities, ones that I see regularly in classrooms and that people to whom I've showed this example have said. One is, someone might say, "Tony, you know, when you're ready to participate appropriately but not playing with your hair and laughing and have a question to ask, I'll come back to you." A second might be to say, "You really need to be a better listener, Tony. Anaya already explained why she picked 1/7. Who else has a real question for Anaya?" It would be funny if it weren't so frequent that that actually is what gets said. Or maybe the ubiquitous, "What do others think?" So I want to consider with you, what does each of these... So these are the 3 possible moves that I read to you. And what's interesting is that in each of those 3, although they're different, Tony is effectively excluded from the discussion. In the first, she's just publicly excluded because she's deemed to be not sort of on task. In the second, she's not only excluded for that reason, but she's deemed to be not listening. And in the third, she's also excluded, and her critical mathematical question, which is central to the point of the lesson, like, is it 7 equal parts? Is it 3 equal parts? What's the whole? Is crucial to this lesson. She's excluded, and therefore the mathematical trajectory of the lesson is also interfered with. But let's think about Tony in particular. What did those 3 teaching moves do to Tony? So all 3 of them signal to her that her contributions to the class aren't appropriate or valuable. And you see a picture of her there quite seriously participating. Instead, her participation and mathematical attentiveness are actually just made invisible. She's erased. But she is seen. She's seen as being a distraction, maybe mocking Anaya and playing with her hair. And these together combine to eclipse her humanity. So let's step back for a minute and think about the larger macro environment in which this micro moment for Tony and Anaya and their classmates is taking place. And let's think about what we know about Black girls and the ways in which they're disciplined in schools. So we know from this report that came out last year, Girlhood Interrupted, the Erasure of Black Girls' Childhood, that discipline is disproportionately inflicted upon Black girls. And here you can see, for example, that while Black girls account for only 1 in 6 of girls in school, they comprise over half of the multiple suspensions, whereas white girls are half of the girls in school and suffer only 1/5 of the multiple suspensions, and there's more detail there. So how does that happen? How does that actually happen? Let's try to think about that. So in the report, what we understand is that these are for subjective judgments. These are not for visible acts. These are for things that teachers have to interpret, like deciding that someone is disruptive or deciding that someone might be bullying. And you can imagine that Tony might be read by a teacher as bullying Anaya, or that she might be read as disruptive or somehow not attentive or not engaged. So it's not that hard to imagine how Tony could easily be asked to step away from the group, to not talk, or maybe even be sent out in the hall. And if she's out in the hall, she's neither learning, she's also been told that she's not valuable, and the rest of the class doesn't benefit from her work. This is serious, and these are all, I want to emphasize, in the discretion of the teacher. These are not about bringing a gun to school. These are about how she's being read and interpreted. So let's think about what it would take to disrupt the patterns that fill the discretionary spaces that make it likely that a Black girl like Tony is marginalized. So it would take at least 2 things. Let's start with those. One is it would take seeing Tony's question as key to the class's work. And the second thing it would take is to see as axiomatic the brilliance of Black children, and therefore both Tony and Anaya as brilliant. So let's be a little more concrete about that. To see Tony's question as key to the mathematical work doesn't come along for free. You actually have to know something about math, and you have to know it in a way that's suitable for teaching, because probably some of you right now aren't entirely sure why I'm saying that her question is central to the class's work, but it is. So just believing that you want to say that isn't enough. You actually have to be able to hear what she's doing mathematically. And in order to take as axiomatic the brilliance of Black girls, you'd actually have to be able to interpret Tony as asking a mathematical question that she really means to ask. And we have a lot of evidence that she does mean to ask that question, because she not only asks it at the end, but she asks while Anaya is explaining. She's watching her carefully and saying, did she just say 1/7? So she clearly has a question she's asking. So let's go on a little bit and talk about her contributions. She's actually listening very closely to a classmate's presentation, and she's using the norm of not beginning by agreeing or disagreeing, which is actually pretty natural, especially when we learn that her answer is 1/3. It would be pretty natural, maybe even for some of you, to start by disagreeing. But instead, she asks a question. I think it's also possible to see that she might not be entirely sure about the 3, because she doesn't have much of an explanation there, and she just heard a really good explanation. Anaya's explanation is really good. She uses the definition for a fraction to explain. She shows what the whole is. She counts equal intervals. She can write 1/7. She gives a really robust explanation. She's pretty persuasive. The only thing that Anaya isn't doing is that she's not considering 0 to 1 to be the unit interval. And that's the new thing that they're all learning. So her explanation is really robust. quite reasonable that Tony might wonder, what have I got here then? So I've already said it would take at least these two things to disrupt the pattern by which a girl like Tony would be marginalized. But it takes more than having the math knowledge to see that and believing in the brilliance of black girls and believing that she means to ask that. You'd actually have to have something different to do. Because what I'm arguing is the normalized practices of schooling would equip you with habits of doing particular kinds of things that would just creep into your practice in those moments without quite realizing it. And those practices, like the ones I showed you, would be marginalizing and reproduce racist and gendered ways of seeing Tony. So we're going to watch now what happens after Tony asks her question. Okay, Tony, what's your question for her? Go ahead, it's your turn.
Why did you pick 1/7?
Let's listen to her answer now. That was a very good question. Can you show us again how you figured out why you decided 1/7? So let's think for a moment then about how using discretion deliberately to interrupt patterns through which essentially the pattern of telling her she's not listening or that she's fooling around or that she's off task gets countered by acknowledging publicly the importance of her question. And the possible result of that is that Tony is trusted to be meaning what she's saying and is being recognized for the contributions of her mathematical work. The precision of her question, it's exactly the right question. There's no other question that would have been a better question to ask at that moment. And she's asking Anaya a very direct and pointed question. So I want to take you now to the end of the lesson, which we're not going to watch, to consider, given that Tony wasn't excluded, and that Anaya and Tony both made these contributions, what happened to the rest of the class as well as to Tony and Anaya? Because these minute-to-minute discretionary spaces have consequences beyond that moment. They shape the trajectory of what happens to the individual girls, the way they're positioned, and the way racism or sexism are or are not reproduced. So Tony, 20 or 30 minutes later, actually was able to explain a fraction with a much more complete justification and was one of two people who went up to the board and volunteered to model what a complete explanation was of locating a fraction on the line and explaining it. Anaya was able to now identify 0 to 1 as the integral and gave a very robust explanation, but even more interestingly, she wrote in her notebook, "I did well on my goal today because my goal was to share my ideas with the class, and I did. I went up to the board and shared my idea with the class on fractions." So it sounds as though that experience of being at the board and having the opportunity to have Tony ask her a question wasn't, as you might worry, bad for her, but actually made her feel positive about her competence. But the class also benefited. I told you earlier that before the discussion, 23 children thought the answer to that problem was something other than 1/3. But 30 minutes after the discussion that you just saw the beginning of, 25 of them were able to identify a fraction and give a rather complete explanation from listening not only to Anaya and Tony, who kicked it off, but the subsequent discussion of other children who contributed after that. They also had an opportunity to see black girls being brilliant, which, given the society in which we live in, is an important part of their opportunity and all of our opportunity to be learning in school. Now, we can understand that if the bodies were different in the example I showed you, take, for example, the teacher were black, or that the child at the board were still black, but the person asking the question were a white boy, the dynamics and the identities would be different, but the analysis is still the same, because there's still a discretionary space, and there's still the moment in which racism and sexism creep in through the normalized practices of schooling, the habits that we have, and the ways in which teachers individually will interpret and read children that will shape the way those discretionary spaces play out.